And so welcome to two old psychologists talking about stuff. Good afternoon, Raymond.
Good afternoon, Richard. Ready to talk away?
Yes, indeed. Now, two ways we can do this. We can either pretend that it's been a while since we last spoke, or we can be honest that it was literally about 10 minutes ago that we stopped doing the last episode. Which do you think we should go for?
I think we should go for authenticity on this occasion. Show the process.
Okay. So I won't ask you how you've been then.
Yeah, or what we've noticed in the last 10 minutes.
No. But maybe you could tell me something else that you've noticed over the past few weeks. It's been a good while since we last met. So what else has been grabbing your attention in the intervening period?
Okay, well, I had a significant birthday, as you were aware. We talked a little bit about, I think, in the previous conversation. And
did it end in a 0?
It ended in 0. Yes, it did. It did. Started in 6. And, I had plans.
Was it 600?
It was 600. Yes, thank you for that thought. The plan would have been that I would have sort of, turned 60, at the midnight I became 60, I suppose. I would have been in a very pleasant medieval Italian town, having had a really luscious Italian meal and a walk back along the river, and then sort of perhaps a little glass of grappa in hand, overlooking the moonlit garden of the B&B we had. And I actually spent it in the baggage reclaim of Gatwick, an airport I'd been in for 11 hours, having got on a plane, been turfed off the plane as the airport was shut, and all this sort of stuff. So my expectations were not exactly met. In that the moment I was turning 60, I was sitting on an, fortunately out of use, luggage carousel, waiting for my bags to be deplaned, having waited there for 2 hours, desperately trying to rebook flights, find an airport hotel and things. I'm feeling understandably both a bit stressed and a little bit sorry for myself. And what I noticed was sort of taking myself to task slightly and saying, well, hang on a second, there's lots of people in the world who would be really kind of stressed at not being able to get out of a country because they were fleeing oppression or a war or something. You're okay, you're safe. By that stage knew I would have some kind of a roof over my head, probably will get to do at least part of this holiday. And I actually found that really helpful, which probably doesn't sound that surprising, but normally I'm a bit kind of cautious about this, it could be worse, as a way of coping. Because, it could be worse. Well, somebody in the world probably has the worst life in the world. And does that mean that nobody else is allowed to accept their suffering or say, that wasn't what I wanted? But actually what I did find was it wasn't so much that others would have it worse, and it wasn't even gratitude in the traditional sense that I felt somebody was looking after me or something, but just noticing actually there's things here that are still pretty good, even in the middle of all this. And that's not about about trying to say to yourself a morally right thing. It was just actually pretty comforting in the moment and just reminded me actually some really nice stuff going on. So I noticed that strategy, which I know is a common one in many ways, actually really worked in that moment. So, yeah, I noticed that.
And what's the strategy, if you could distill it there? Is that something about just sort of tuning into the present moment and just noticing that there's more going on here than whatever pesky thoughts are running through your head at that point?
Yeah. I think certainly it's kind of coming into the present moment and exactly sort of noticing I am having these thoughts, I am having these feelings. Absolutely is a big part of that. I think the other bit for me is noticing the things that I do have and noticing the things that I do value and connecting to those and saying, okay, there may be some things that would have been nice to be here that aren't here in this moment. But there's actually, I'm in a really kind of fortunate position in lots of other ways in that, I'm with someone I love and, we're doing something nice to celebrate something and we will probably be safe and fed tonight and safety and nutrition, they matter. So actually, yeah, sort of noticing and connecting to stuff that matters.
Nice. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned this because the thing I was going to mention was also a holiday gone wrong caused by a breakdown, a vehicle breakdown. So that the plan was to go to some far-flung part of the UK and explore the coastline. And yeah, it didn't quite go to plan because broke down. Mine's a bit more ranty than yours, which perhaps points the differences between us. You're just nicer. than I am.
I wondered when you'd notice.
I mean, it's totally a first world problem, right? Like that your holiday doesn't quite go according to plan. There are clearly much more difficult issues that people face in the world. And I do genuinely admire your ability to meet your disappointing 60th birthday with good grace, and to sort of tune into the things that really matter, and the good stuff that's still there despite this momentary disappointment. The thing that grabbed me, and I found quite hard to let go of, was like you've got breakdown cover,
Hmm.
and you sort of think, well, if I pay for that, that's all right, isn't it? Because if I break down, I'll just be recovered and it'll be fine. I'm going to go from there to globalization, because what happens is that you have a contract with a company, but they have subcontracted out to loads of other people. And so there's a bit of a disconnect between the contract you think you had and the service you're actually going to get. Do you know what I'm saying? There then becomes this whole business around, well, there's a company that's going to recover you, and then there's also a company that's going to supply you with a courtesy car, but they're not the same company. And so we've got to somehow then coordinate these two things, get you a courtesy car, and then recover you. Can't recover you till you've got your courtesy car, and you can't get your courtesy car because it's a bank holiday.
Wow.
Doesn't matter that your vehicle is on double yellow lines on a very narrow Welsh road. Long story short, the good grace and generosity of some friends who were staying nearby kind of saved the day. Without them, it would have been a very miserable experience. I noticed that it presses my buttons around kind of this globalized world that we live in, whereby the connection to the actual people providing the service, and whoever you've sort of signed a contract with, is many, many steps removed.
Right.
When it came to the taxi company that were going to take me to the place to get the courtesy car, it was like Mike's Taxis or something. And that was great because the taxi didn't appear when it was supposed to, but I could just ring Mike and ask him. And that's what I like. So yeah, big companies that kind of being divorced from the service they offer. That is one of the things that I know is a real trigger for me. Getting lost in the bureaucracy of big organisations, I find that really quite challenging.
And given that we've talked kind of several times about this idea of, a very simplified idea, admittedly, of kind of our evolutionary history. And, sort of probably in small communities, maybe, between 50 and 250 people. And, if you went to the pig guy, the guy who knows about pigs in your community, he would be the person you talk to, or she would be the person you talk to. And they would do whatever you needed doing to look after your pigs. And, the difference between that and this whole fragmented, subcontracted thing that still, they don't mention this in the adverts, do they? They don't say, pay us a large amount of money and you might get a very fragmented and disconnected service, but you might at some point get back. That's not the main advertising line. It's still the presentation is, you've got a relationship with us and we will provide. When actually what goes on just behind that very kind of familiar thing that we are attracted to doing, is really different now.
It is very different now. And I'm finding, I think genuinely it is different. I know older people are fond of saying, "Oh, it was much better when I was a kid," but it has changed, hasn't it? I think the sort of globalization has impacted the way that lots of services are offered, and there is a sense of feeling quite removed. It's that old chestnut of you can't just go and chat to the bank manager anymore.
Very.
So anyway, that was me. Yeah. So an opportunity to practice acceptance, which I took with both hands, and
another flipping acceptance opportunity,
indeed.
as I've heard you say many times, and I have quoted to many other people that's coming from.
Indeed. And and I think it's fair to say it is definitely a first world problem. Having your holiday plans disrupted is in the grand scheme of things is survivable, isn't it?
Yeah.
So seamless link time, this, I think it speaks to me about the importance of context, and that nothing occurs in a vacuum, does it? And so there's always a context around a thing, an event, a stimulus. And what we were going to talk about today in our ongoing mini-series of unpacking the words in the title, this feels like the challenging one. We're going to talk about. So tenuously, we tried to find a way of making sense of this. And so you said that we could have called this podcast Two Old Psychologists Discussing Stuff. And we decided to call it Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff. Talking about are kind of the same thing. You used a fancy word. What did you say talking about was?
I think I described it as a compound verb, though I'm not sure whether that's the right term or not. It just sort of seemed right to me.
Right. So we've challenged ourselves, and I guess that we're trying to create an episode, two episodes where there could have just been one. So about. If I say about to you, what shows up?
I suppose two things show up. One of which is like around, so there are several pubs about here. So the idea is that there's things kind of somehow around or in the vicinity of. But the other one, which is kind of very different, isn't it, is directly targeted at and linked to, this is about technology, this is about furniture. So that's something about focus, I suppose.
And it kind of implies, doesn't it, one thing, as you say, being linked to another thing. There's a relation.
Yeah.
See what I did there? Not just a pretty face. Building on what we talked about in the last episode, language involves a series of relations, doesn't it? Nothing makes sense on its own. Everything has to be considered in the context of something else.
Yeah.
So saying, for example, whales are big only really makes sense if you have in your head some things that are smaller than whales. So whales are big in relation to other mammals, but if you were comparing whales and planets, whales are small. So it's the importance of context, and this kind of language ability that we have enables us to do this relating. We could have talked about this before, and we learn as we grow older, we learn to relate things together in increasingly complex ways. And the scope of that is pretty much without limit. So we're going to play a little game to illustrate that, if that's okay.
Yes, I think it is. I'm intrigued.
Right. You can see why we don't rehearse here, because I like to keep you on the spot, keep you on your toes. It's a parlour game favoured by the French aristocracy and probably like the mid-19th century or something, and it's called Corpse Exquise.
Sounds slightly sinister.
It does sound slightly sinister. There's no corpses involved. The idea is that I give you two words and you have to combine them in a sentence.
Okay. I'm ready.
Right, you've limbered up.
I've done my Pilates exercises. I'm all good.
Okay, so your two words are strawberry and cable.
With a C?
Yes. Okay.
The colour of the live cable wasn't an ordinary red. It was almost strawberry coloured.
Oh, that's good. Should we go again?
Uh-huh.
Mobile bag.
I lost my mobile phone and found it at the bottom of my kit bag.
Your what? Your kit bag?
Kit bag. So I sound like a 1950s national service man all of a sudden.
What
as I came up
in your kit bag?
I keep my packet of woodbines and my
your D-Mob suit.
Post and my D-Mob suit. It's what happens when you turn 60.
Lovely, right. So you're demonstrating the flexibility of language here, that we can give you two apparently random words and you can place them in a sentence. You can find ways of relating them together that make sense. What if I challenged you to do this in a slightly more complex way? So I'm going to give you the words and I'm going to give you a contextual cue. So your two words are blind and tree, and your contextual cue is comes before.
The word blind comes before the word tree alphabetically.
Fantastic. That is good.
That's about the surface form of them, isn't it? It's not really about their meanings. So I probably cheated a bit there.
Well, it doesn't matter. I think you rose to the challenge. Let's keep the same words, blind and tree, and then the contextual cue is is next to.
The blind mouse is next to the tree to hide from the farmer's wife.
Excellent. Great. See how this works?
Mm.
I mean, last time you were able to derive that, I forgot the guy's name now, Dave was older than Malcolm
Dave and
without being trained.
Alan and Malcolm, and yeah.
Yeah. And now you're just generating sentences just like this. You're a clever man indeed, Ray.
Well, thank you. I mean, maybe we can replace A levels and degree examinations with this game. That would be good.
Ray levels.
TM, you heard it here first. A levels.
So the serious point here is that human language, has this incredibly sort of generative ability that you can relate anything to absolutely anything else. And the possibilities that gives us in terms of our ability to communicate with each other are kind of limitless. And what's the big deal? You know, if we sort of point our attention towards this ability that we have, what do you think is the usefulness of it? Or can you think of a way that you might use this in the work of a psychologist, or in the service of being useful to the human race as a whole?
Well, as you're describing it that way, you know, some of those are ideas I'm kind of familiar with, but not used to it being put exactly that way. The thing it really makes me think most of is metaphor, is the human ability that comes with language to use metaphors, analogies, similes, which are kind of, you know, very similar words to each other, but where we talk about one thing by talking about something else, you know, which is a very, very widespread thing. Classic one would be something like, you know, life is a roller coaster. So, you know, in English class, you'd be taught, well, it's a simile if you say life is like a roller coaster. And it's a metaphor if you say life is a roller coaster. I think in everyday life, it doesn't really matter that much whether you put in the is like or not. It's kind of assumed that, you know, you're not literally saying life is a roller coaster. But the idea that talking about it that way might bring some benefits in terms of all sorts of things, in terms of our ability to communicate, just the fun and the joy of language, making us think about things differently, a bit of perspective taking, generating some new ideas. But also in our work as psychologists, and particularly this sort of psychological flexibility model that you and I are both involved with, Rich, you know, we use metaphors a lot as a way of helping people bring learning and experience and knowledge they already have in one area of their life, which they might not have seen as being applicable to the problem they have come with. And rather than saying, well, you know, you're a blank sheet, you know nothing about this kind of how to respond to this, let me, the expert, teach you this. Rather saying the stuff that you're very aware of in other areas of your life, and if we can just bring that across and see how it relates here, maybe you've already got some of the tools for dealing with it.
Could you walk us through an example?
Well, I suppose a very short example, a very brief one, would be, you know, we sometimes talk about the quicksand metaphor. So the metaphor that we are aiming for is struggling with our emotions is a bit like struggling against quicksand, or struggling when you find yourself in quicksand. We might present it in a different way. We might, you know, leave the punchline of, this is about emotions till later. But introducing the idea that people of a certain generation, and there's, you know, some evidence that not as many popular TV shows and stories now talk about people getting stuck in quicksand as when you and I were growing up. Children's TV particularly was full of people having to be rescued by friendly animals or the heroes from the local village pulling you out of quicksand, you know. But the idea that many people are familiar with, that if stuck in quicksand, the incredibly natural urge is to struggle and flail about and try and push yourself down to lever yourself out of this stuff. Whereas because of the physics of quicksand, the more you do that, the more you kind of get pulled in to it. So you know, that is a story, a set of little rules about the world that people are very familiar being over here in the quicksand story, which they learned from Westerns or Skippy the Bush Kangaroo or whatever. And what we're doing in using a metaphor is helping people bring that learning across to a parallel idea, which, you know, psychology and research and stuff tells us that the harder we try and push away certain kinds of thoughts and feelings, the more they tend to pull us in. And we can have that conversation. We could go straight in route one and just explain it. Well, the thing about thoughts is, the thing about feelings is, and that would be useful. Sometimes they'll sound like quite abstract words, or sometimes it might feel like new learning that people are trying to build on top of feeling very stressed. As soon as you start talking about thoughts and feelings, they're getting lost in the problem that brought us here. Whereas if what we can do is we can pull across, if a person already has a representation of what happens when you struggle against quicksand, or you get pulled further in, that learning already exists within the person. And it's come back to the word you used before, relating. We can then relate that with the person, and they can be more likely to say, oh, this is one of those quicksand things, isn't it? Yeah, it's a simple example of a metaphor, but it's an example of one that genuinely I use. I don't know, do you use the quicksand one, Rich?
Yeah, I have done. Yeah, particularly with people with anxiety related issues, because it feels particularly pertinent there. So I might say, struggling with your anxiety like this is much like struggling with quicksand,
Mm.
because the more you struggle with it, the more you say to yourself, don't be anxious, don't be anxious, don't be anxious. Oh no, I'm getting anxious. Stop being anxious. The more kind of overwhelmed you become, the more that anxiety sort of pulls you in. I suppose the thing that I always think about it is it's just a hell of a lot quicker than doing half an hour of psychoeducation about anxiety.
Yeah.
It's just there's something kind of really immediate about it if you can find something that the person can relate to. Like obviously, as you said, if people aren't familiar with quicksand, then it's not going to work, is it?
Yeah, and that's one of the principles of metaphor, isn't it? Is that the technical term, that the vehicle, the story that you're telling has to be more familiar to the person than the points you're trying to make.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. There's a couple of interesting things that I think about that. One is that, as you said, there's some evidence that the quicksand metaphor, which is a sort of acceptance and commitment therapy classic, the impact of that is declining over time because people aren't watching Westerns and they're not seeing people getting stuck and having to whistle their horse. So you need to find a vehicle that is perhaps more well known or more relatable. So, for example, there's the Royal National Lifeboat Association advert about what to do if you fall in the sea, which is the same thing. Which if you flail around, you'll drown really quick. You need to kind of be calm and lie on the surface of the water if possible. So that's interesting. That in order to sort of make a metaphor useful, it has to resonate with the person that you're trying to use it for. Otherwise, you're overcomplicating the situation rather than simplifying it.
Yeah.
Then the other thing, which is a frivolous thing, which is once me and our good friend Joe Oliver, we were doing some training on acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm going to call it ACT from now on. ACT training in Birmingham, and we were making the point that this is a somewhat arbitrary thing because everyone seems to know about quicksand despite never having fallen in it. And then somebody produced a video of their partner flailing around in quicksand.
No.
Yeah, in Birmingham. And we had two good things about that. One, it's in Birmingham, and second, it's on a video. rather than help the partner out of the quicksand, it's like, no, let's film this. This would be great on TikTok. Yeah. So metaphors, I think that there's an efficiency in it, isn't there? There's an incredible, what you're doing in relational frame theory terms is you're sort of piggybacking some new learning on top of some old, like an existing relational network. And that's why it's so efficient because you don't have to spend time establishing the relations. You can just say this set of relations is like this set of relations and then job done.
And then that pulls it across. Absolutely. And of course, what's also nice about metaphors is they can be quite generative. They can create new stuff that neither the person who's seeking help nor the therapist has ever thought of before. Sometimes people talk about these as emergent properties of the metaphor. I don't know, if you go back to life is a roller coaster, so what's the point there? What's the target of this metaphor is typically would be something like, well, it's full of ups and downs. And that's how people use it in general speech, I think. But of course, we can then also, if we want to, think, is there anything else here to notice that we've not thought of before? So, what else is true of being on a roller coaster that may or may not turn out to be relevant to coping with life's challenges? Well, I think one thing that's probably true about roller coasters is how much you enjoy it depends on who's sitting next to you. Okay, that will be true of roller coasters. Can we transfer across? Is there something to think about what's true of life's pressures? Well, actually, probably that does pull across. It wasn't why we set up this metaphor, but we can look there, you know. Another one is if it gets too much and you throw up, then others are likely to suffer. Okay, so metaphorically, you know, when we struggle and if it kind of become uncontained and stuff, it will affect the people around us in the pressures of life. So I think one of the things that's very useful in working with metaphors is being willing to have a little look around and say, is there anything else about that vehicle, that story that produces a new and novel idea, which, and this is the important thing, which we then have to test because like there may be loads of things about being on a roller coaster that aren't true of life. I don't know, you know, sort of.
You're only allowed on if you're a certain height.
Well, there you go. Yeah. You have to queue for ages and ages, and then,
Yeah.
you know, it's over too quick. I don't know. I suppose
People,
there's some religions that
people of all heights can do life as opposed to roller coasters.
There you go. There you go. So yeah, so we have to test it. And this is another example, I think, of a thing we often say is checking how stuff lands. You know, we don't have to know in advance that this is going to be the perfect metaphor for a person and that all these lessons are applicable, but we have to sort of be curious with them and see, is there something here to learn? Is there something here to learn? And be very respectful of where the limits of the metaphor are and say, yeah, that bit doesn't apply, does it? Let's pull back out and talk about things in the real terms rather than these metaphor terms now.
Yeah, because I mean, that's the thing. I don't know how you sort of see your role as a psychologist. I guess in broad terms, I think I see mine as helping people put their feet down differently, you know, as they walk through life. And so these insights are all very well, and I don't think that's enough on its own, that you just sort of develop a new way of thinking about something. That has then to translate into a new way of doing things. So I think, you know, you can take, say, the quicksand idea, you can take that, you know, so if in quicksand you need to sort of lie flat and make contact with as much of the quicksand, with as much of your body as possible, and that will keep you afloat, you know, what does that mean for anxiety?
Yeah.
And that sort of leads us into this interesting territory of maybe I need to kind of contact this stuff. Maybe I need to feel it rather than trying so hard to avoid it. Like maybe I'd be better off if I could experience the anxiety rather than invest so much energy in trying to get away from it that I end up, you know, burying myself further in it. So I think it has to come back to it's got a practical application, not just an insight on its own.
Yeah. I mean, I strongly think that in my work, guess one of the characteristics of a lot of my work has been people encountering new major challenges, often obviously mainly health related, you know, rather than purely kind of lifelong struggles, but, you know, hitting new challenges. And I think that's partly shaped me thinking that what people need in the face of that, what I need if things are difficult, is kind of like two things: a way of making sense of what's going on, and then an idea of what to do about it. And yeah, making sense by itself is an intervention, but it's not normally sufficient. It may well be necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient. And the nice thing about the metaphor is it can be just a help to sense making. And sometimes, as you gave us very clearly there with the quicksand metaphor, it can actually suggest some things to try. It doesn't mean that trying that will definitely work, but it generates possibilities that we can then try and see what happens. And if it seems to work, hold on to it in our repertoire for this specific person. And if not, think, well, what else?
I don't know whether you came up with this, or I certainly heard it from you. A beautiful metaphor that I've returned to a lot with people where they've had life-changing situations, so injury or, you know, like a really difficult constraint placed upon them, so the end of a relationship or loss of a job or something like that, was that idea of the playing on the beach metaphor. So the idea there was, let's imagine that you really value connection with your loved ones, and the thing that you find most connecting of all is going to the beach to play rounders. And so, you know, you look at the tide tables, you get there early before the crowds, and you've got a big space to play on, and you play rounders, and it's great and it's connecting. And then, of course, the context starts to change. So that the tide comes in, more people start to arrive on the beach, there's less space. So rounders isn't workable anymore. And so you have to think of something else to do. And if you can keep your value of connection at the forefront, what else might you do in this new sort of constrained situation? And so, I don't know, what you might build sandcastles, or you might bury granddad up to his neck in the sand or something, until that doesn't become viable anymore. The tide comes in, takes the sandcastles away. We have to rescue granddad before he drowns. And you've got to take your towels and your bags up because they're all going to get washed away. And
Yeah.
you look up the beach and actually there's no space left. What are you
Mm.
going to do now? But if you keep connection at the core of things, then maybe you don't even need the beach, right? You can just go to the cafe.
Yeah.
And that I found is really sort of poignant metaphor for perhaps life closing in around people, and people having to adapt to a changing set of circumstances or really significant constraints, but how you can still find value even in those constrained situations.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And what you need to do to find that value has to change as the context changes. To persevere in the thing that worked before would mean you all got washed out to sea, or the game stopped and you gave up. So yeah, that element of we need to change, and equally just staring out to sea and saying, "Oh God, the tide's coming in, the tide's coming in, the tide's coming in," rather than getting on with rounders, then Boole. Then I'm sure you did hear it from me. I didn't originate that. That was a psychologist from the Northeast who worked in palliative care called Pete Blackburn who came up with that. And interestingly, it became the basis of an intervention that's been researched in day hospices in Scotland, because it just seemed to resonate so well. Great example of why a metaphor can do this. I mean, the other thing that I always think with metaphors, one of the reasons metaphors are so powerful, is it's almost like sidestepping an immune system. Because some of the people I'd be dealing with, if it was literally about facing death, that word's very charged. The concept of losing contact with your family, not being around for your family, it can be so emotionally overwhelming that as soon as you start try and talk about the principles, and if you tried to say, trying to keep connection, is really important, that you can do it if we find some different ways of doing it. All that might get lost as soon as you start talking about, as time gets shorter, as this, when you're in the hospice and stuff. Whereas if we can sidestep to a metaphor, we can kind of like get to the point without evoking all of those interfering levels of distress. So you've kind of almost got there before that stuff kicks in and interferes, which I think is one of the other benefits of metaphors in therapeutic work.
Yeah, it's exploiting this thing about relating to one thing in the context of another. But yeah, I'd totally agree with that. I think I've noticed less resistance to a metaphor than trying to problem solve directly.
And obviously, we're talking about like greatest hit metaphors. And within this approach, this ACT approach, there's a book called The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, which is just an indication of how useful all of this is. And including this book saying it, I've certainly found the very best metaphors are the ones that people bring to us, rather than the ones that we have in our repertoire ready to dispense. Because people may already have thought through metaphors, or they may spontaneously generate them during a session, or they may be kind of there without them noticing it. Because that's the funny thing about metaphor, isn't it? It's so embedded in our language. People don't even notice. If I say I am inclined to agree with you, inclined, what's inclined actually mean? Inclined means I am leaning towards agreeing with you. So even in saying I'm inclined to agree with you, I'm talking metaphorically. And we could choose to say, okay, so that's like a word about leaning forward, isn't it? What's it like to lean forward? So actually being able to pursue metaphors that other people are either bringing explicitly or implicitly, there's more of a chance that it's going to map to their whole learning history and their context. So long as, this bit's really important, we check our assumptions, that we are hearing what we think we're hearing, and they are meaning by it what we think they're meaning by it. Else, a small cautionary tale here about one metaphor I found very useful and others have said they've found useful, which is about playing cards. Okay, I'm not a big card player, but my understanding is that if you're playing poker and you're dealt a hand of tens and jacks and queens and things, you play it in a certain way. If you're dealt a hand with like twos and threes and fours, you can't afford to play it the same way. You have to play it differently. And I'd kind of heard somebody say this once, and he said, "Oh, that's perfect." A patient had brought it to me. That's perfect for people now dealing with physical ill health. And a few times I then used it back at others, until somebody who did actually play poker said, "You do realise if you get handed the two or three, you just throw your hand in burn. Are you saying I get to this situation, I should just give up and kill myself then. I think, okay, that metaphor did not land how I intended it to. So, cautionary tale, always check out how the metaphor's landing.
Intention and actual function aren't the same thing, are they? And I think that's a big sort of lesson in communication more broadly, isn't it? That what you think you have said, what you have transmitted, for example, is not necessarily what other people have received. Yeah.
It's the constant therapist nightmare, isn't it? Is the patient who comes into the session, a client who comes into the session and starts it off with, "Well, I did what you said," and you have no memory of telling them to do anything or suggesting they did anything, and what am I going to hear next?
So, in terms of a useful thing for people to take away, so here's one that I use a lot with people. So, I want you to imagine, if you would, that you
Mhm.
have a identical twin sat next to you. So maybe just take a little look to your left. Can you kind of imagine that guy sitting there?
Mhm.
So he looks like you. He's been everywhere that you've been, seen everything that you've seen. He's been a constant companion right from day one. And you notice that he's commentating,
Right.
constantly talking in your ear, offering advice. How long's this going to go on? We're about 45 minutes already. Shouldn't this stop by now? What am I having for tea? Where's Rich
Mm.
going with this? I wish we'd
Mhm.
rehearsed. All that kind of
All of
stuff.
those.
All of
You know
those.
my twin well. Yeah.
And my invitation to you is to think about, how would you manage that situation? So there's this constant stream of observations, judgments, suggestions, advice coming from this guy. What are you tempted to do? What's the first thing that you think of?
I'm kind of tempted to tell him to shut up
Okay.
because it's distracting and irritating.
Okay. So let's say we do that. We could get the gaffer tape out and you know, shut him up, stick him in a cupboard. Do you think you'd lose anything? Any downsides to
Oh,
that?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure some of the things he says would probably be really useful and helpful. And also, I'd feel so bad about doing that, that's mainly what I'd be thinking about, and the banging in the cupboard and the wondering if he could actually breathe and things. I guess fairly hard to actually engage with this conversation or whatever it is I am going to have for my tea.
Right. If you totally shut him up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of downsides there then. So one, maybe you miss something useful, and two, there's the guilt that comes from treating this, well-intentioned but maybe annoying companion
Mm.
in such a way. Another strategy then? What else could you do?
Well, rather than just being irritated, I could sort of pay better attention to him, listen more on the basis that he probably does know he's my twin, so he can think as well as I can. So maybe what he has to say is useful, so I could just attend more fully to him, I suppose.
Okay. Well, if we took that to the extreme, like if you just do everything he says,
Mm.
what do you think about that?
Well, then I'd sort of lose control of what I do. And I guess what he does kind of varies a bit minute by minute as well. So I'd forever be having to change horse
Okay.
mid-course. So I probably wouldn't get on and do the things I wanted to do.
Where's the compromise position that you think would work best for you, do you think, between those two extremes?
I guess I could try and strike a deal and say, look, I'm not going to listen to every word of this because this is quite distracting. If I'm feeling stuck, I'm going to ask you for advice and I'll take it seriously. But either could you keep quiet with the other stuff, or you're just going to have to accept I'm just going to let that be like noise in the background. But sometimes if I am stuck, I will listen.
Okay. So you're talking about sort of discriminating, really, aren't you? Deciding that there is some sort of tuning in, deciding that there may be some of this stuff, if it's useful, then I'll pay attention. Maybe I'll even follow the advice. But other times it's going to be like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, something like that.
All right. So the punchline here, of course, is that you've already got that. It's not a separate entity. It's not another Ray, but there is a kind of Ray located in between your ears who's constantly doing this, constantly commentating, offering judgments. There's your, whatever you want to call it, your mind. I mean, that's a metaphor as well, I think, in itself. But
Yeah.
there's a part of you that narrates incessantly, and I guess the thing that I would want you to take away, and other people, if I talk about this thing with them, is this idea that ability to discriminate. Just because our mind says something doesn't mean we have to go along with it, but neither is your mind your enemy. It's just a well-intentioned but slightly irritating twin or PA or whatever you want to think about it. And the best kind of sort of healthy relationship to have with it is that one where you can discriminate between the stuff that says is useful and the stuff that says that isn't.
That's nice. I've not heard that one before.
You can have that. Feel free to take that away and use it.
No, but
Okay,
I see the function. I see the use. Yeah.
right. I think it's probably time for your question.
Bated breath.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
So, we're in some kind of post-apocalyptic situation. The mushroom cloud is erupting in the distance. You scour your living room for keepsakes, things that you want to take with you as you run as fast as you can in the other direction. You scour your shelf of DVDs and you can only pick one. Which
Ooh.
one are you going to take with you in the hope that the shelter is also stuck in the 90s and has a DVD player?
That is a very good question. I think I would probably take The Blues Brothers because it's a film I've always been really fond of. It makes me smile. It's a kind of comfort movie, and I might need a lot of comfort in this post-apocalyptic world. And I love the music, and my experience is that films with music in, you can watch way more times on repeat than non-musical films. So I think I'd probably take The Blues Brothers.
I was not expecting you to say that.
Yeah, I can occasionally surprise you.
I like that. I like being surprised by you. Hey,
What
Blues
would you?
Brothers. What would I take?
Yeah, let's ask Rich.
Oh, I think I would take Star Wars. And when I say Star Wars, I mean what's subsequently become known as Episode 4 or A New Hope. But in
The
my
original
day,
movie.
it was just called Star Wars. The original 1977 movie, just because of the sort of connotations it has, I suppose. When I was 6 and I went to see that in the cinema, it was just life changing, and
Yeah.
I remember this visceral feeling of sitting there thinking nothing will ever be the same again. But I have seen Star Wars, and it's just been a sort of
Brilliant.
childhood wonder of
Yeah.
this sort of taking a glimpse into this amazing sort of universe that I've never quite been able to shake off. And I've sort of been a ardent Star Wars fan through thick and thin, it must be said, ever since. So I probably would take that. I think I'd find it hard to look beyond that. There's plenty of
Yeah.
other films I love, but that's probably the one I'd have to take.
And maybe that cues us into something we might talk about in a future episode, which I know we kind of kicked about, something I'm interested in, which is, what does it mean to be a fan? What does it mean to really love something again through thick and thin? So maybe that's something we can come back to.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Thanks a lot then. It's been fun today.
Really
I'll see you
has.
again soon.
Will indeed. See you then.